I have been called a lot of things in my life, but my father's favorite nickname was always the family failure. He used it so often that relatives stopped reacting to it. It became part of my introduction. "How's the lawyer doing?" people would ask. Dad would beam with pride and point toward my older brother. Then someone would ask about me. Dad would shrug and say, "Oh, him? That's our family failure. He collects parking fees." Everybody laughed. Every single time. I wish I could say it bothered me enough to start an argument, but honestly, after hearing the joke for 15 years, it had lost its sting. It was like listening to a radio commercial that played every day. Annoying, sure, but predictable. The funny part was that nobody ever bothered asking what I actually did. As far as my family knew, I spent my days sitting in tiny parking booths, handing out tickets and collecting fees from impatient drivers. To be fair, I did spend time at parking lots. Just not in the way they imagined. Meanwhile, my older brother was the golden child. He was a successful attorney with expensive suits, an expensive car, and an even more expensive ego. At every family gathering, he found a way to remind everyone how important he was. "You wouldn't believe the contract I negotiated this week. You should have seen the judge's reaction. My billable hours are insane." Dad practically glowed whenever he spoke. Then he'd glance at me. "You know, your brother owns 3 watches worth more than your car." "That's nice," I'd say. "It would be even nicer if you had a real career." The family would laugh again. I usually smiled and kept eating. Nothing irritated them more than my refusal to defend myself. A few months earlier, I'd started dating someone who found the entire situation hilarious. She wasn't human. That wasn't unusual anymore. Ever since the Alliance opened trade routes between Earth and several neighboring systems, interspecies relationships had become increasingly common. She worked as an urban development consultant, helping corporations evaluate expansion projects across multiple worlds. She was brilliant, beautiful, dangerously observant. The first time she attended a family barbecue from a distance, and watched my father introduce me as a disappointment, she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. "Your family truly believes you're unsuccessful?" "Absolutely. After everything you've accomplished?" "Especially after everything I've accomplished." That only made her laugh harder. According to her, humans were the only species capable of hiding success so effectively that even their own relatives couldn't recognize it. A few days later, Dad called another family dinner. The moment I walked into the restaurant, I knew something was coming. He had that look. The one that usually appeared right before he compared me to my brother. Sure enough, 10 minutes later he raised his glass. "I just want everyone to know that my oldest son is involved in a major commercial property closing next week." My brother smiled modestly, which somehow made him look even more arrogant. "It's a significant project." Dad nodded proudly. "A very significant project." Then his eyes landed on me. "Maybe your brother can explain it to you. Assuming parking meters don't require too much attention these days." The table erupted again. I took a sip of my drink. My brother smirked. Dad looked pleased with himself. And for the first time in years, I found myself smiling for a completely different reason. Because I had received a phone call earlier that morning. A very important phone call. One confirming that I would also be attending that same property closing. The difference was that my invitation wasn't as a spectator. Nobody at that table knew it yet. But very soon, they were all going to hear my name read aloud. And everything they thought they knew about the family failure was about to change. The truth was that my family's biggest mistake wasn't calling me a failure. It was assuming they already knew my story. Most people see a parking lot and think it's just a place to leave a vehicle for a few hours. A patch of asphalt. White painted lines. Nothing exciting. I saw something different. I saw land. Years earlier, while my brother was climbing the corporate ladder and collecting framed certificates for his office wall, I was buying tiny parking lots across the city. Not glamorous ones. Not downtown landmarks. I'm talking about forgotten pieces of property squeezed between warehouses, abandoned factories, and aging shopping districts. The kinds of places nobody wanted. The kinds of places nobody even noticed. Which made them cheap. Very cheap. Whenever I saved enough money, I bought another one. Then another. Then another. People laughed when they heard about it. Even bank managers occasionally looked confused. You want another parking lot? Yes. Are you sure? Very. The funny thing about being underestimated is that nobody pays attention to what you're doing. My brother bought luxury cars. I bought asphalt. Dad praised him for it. Nobody praised me. That turned out to be an excellent business strategy. A few years ago, I met the woman who would completely change my life. We met during a property assessment meeting. She represented an interstellar development company that specialized in future expansion projects. I expected a boring consultation. Instead, I spent 3 hours talking with the smartest woman I'd ever met. She challenged every assumption I had. She understood economics, infrastructure, transportation systems, and urban growth patterns better than anyone on Earth. Most importantly, she actually listened when I spoke. Our first date lasted 6 hours. Our second lasted 8. By the third date, I knew I was in trouble. Not because she was an alien. Because I was falling in love. Over the years she became my partner in every sense of the word. Sometimes we'd spend entire evenings reviewing development proposals and city planning reports together. She never directly gave me confidential information. She was far too professional for that. But she taught me how to recognize patterns. How populations moved. How businesses expanded. How transportation networks created opportunity. Eventually I started noticing something. The city was growing toward many of the areas where I owned parking lots. Fast. Extremely fast. One forgotten property became valuable. Then another. Then another. Suddenly developers weren't ignoring my calls anymore. They were making offers. Large offers. Ridiculously large offers. Meanwhile, my family remained completely unaware. Dad continued giving me financial advice every holiday. My favorite conversation happened during Thanksgiving. He spent 20 minutes explaining the importance of investing. Then my brother joined the discussion. He gave a passionate speech about building wealth. The entire time, either of them realized my net worth had already surpassed both of theirs combined. I nearly choked trying not to laugh. A week before the closing, my phone rang. The representative confirmed everything. The final paperwork was ready. The acquisition would proceed as scheduled. After hanging up, I called my girlfriend. The moment she answered, she asked, "Is it official?" "It is." There was a brief silence. Then she started laughing. Not a polite laugh. The kind of laugh that makes breathing difficult. "Oh no." "What?" "Your father is going to experience emotional damage on a historic scale." I couldn't help laughing too. "Possibly." "No, definitely." She laughed harder. "I should bring a camera." "That's cruel." "Maybe. You enjoy this far too much." She paused for a moment. "To be fair, I've spent years listening to people call one of the smartest humans I know a failure. That's surprisingly romantic. I'm an alien. We express affection through accurate observations." I smiled. 3 days later, the entire family would gather at the title office expecting another victory celebration for my brother. None of them knew that the biggest surprise of their lives was waiting inside a stack of legal documents. And none of them were prepared for the moment my name would be read aloud. The morning of the closing felt strangely normal. The sun came up. Traffic filled the streets. People rushed to work. Meanwhile, my father was preparing for what he believed would be one of the proudest days of his life. My brother arrived at the title office wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first 3 parking lots combined. Dad couldn't stop smiling. Every few minutes he found a new reason to praise him. "Big commercial projects don't happen without talented people." My brother nodded modestly. "I just do my job." That statement alone nearly qualified as comedy. I arrived a few minutes later with my girlfriend. Dad greeted her politely before immediately turning his attention back to my brother. That was fine with me. My girlfriend leaned close and whispered, "I feel like I'm watching a nature documentary." "What kind?" "The one where the prey doesn't realize the predator is behind them." I almost laughed out loud. The conference room slowly filled with investors, attorneys, city representatives, and development executives. My brother recognized several people and spent the next 20 minutes networking. Dad followed him around like a proud campaign manager. I sat quietly near the back of the room. Exactly where everyone expected me to be. The family failure. The parking lot guy. The human cautionary tale. Finally, the title officer entered carrying a thick stack of documents. Everyone took their seats. The room grew quiet. The officer began reviewing the transaction details. Property descriptions. Development agreements. Ownership structures. Legal requirements. The process dragged on long enough that even my brother started checking his watch. Dad remained excited. Every few minutes he glanced toward my brother, as if waiting for applause to begin. Then the title officer reached the final ownership section. "This acquisition involves the transfer of multiple properties and development rights under a consolidated ownership agreement." Several people nodded. The officer adjusted his glasses. "Then read my full name." The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence where people suddenly become aware of every breath they take. Dad blinked. My brother frowned. The officer continued reading. Again, he said my name. My father looked around the room. Then at me. Then back at the officer. "I'm sorry," Dad interrupted. "There must be some confusion." The officer checked the paperwork. "No confusion, sir." He pointed directly toward me. "This individual is the primary purchaser." The room became even quieter. Which I hadn't thought was possible. My brother stared at me. "Purchaser?" I nodded. Dad actually laughed. Not because he thought it was funny. Because he thought it was impossible. Then the title officer started explaining. The development project required numerous strategically located properties. Over the past decade, those properties had gradually been acquired by a single owner. Parking lots. Transit access points. Small commercial parcels. Several key locations needed for future expansion. Every single one belonged to me. The officer listed addresses. One after another. And after every address came the same owner. Me. My brother's face slowly lost all color. Dad looked like someone had unplugged his brain. The officer eventually reached the financial summary. The final valuation exceeded every number my family had imagined. Dad's jaw physically dropped. My girlfriend immediately covered her mouth. Not because she was shocked. Because she was trying not to laugh. The officer wasn't finished. "The purchasing entity has elected to retain majority ownership in the new shopping center development." Dad slowly turned toward me. "You own this?" "Most of it." "Most of it?" My brother looked horrified. "You bought the project?" "Technically, yes. But you collect parking fees." I smiled. "Sometimes." Across the table, my girlfriend finally lost the battle. A laugh escaped. Then another. Within seconds, she was trying desperately to regain control. Unfortunately, every time she looked at my father's expression, she laughed harder. The title officer continued reading final confirmations while my family's entire understanding of reality collapsed around them. For 15 years they had called me the family failure. For 15 years they had laughed at the parking lot guy. And now an entire room full of professionals was waiting for me to sign documents that would make me the owner of a multi-million credit shopping center. The best part? We hadn't even reached the signatures yet. Things were about to get much, much funnier. The signatures took less than 10 minutes. The aftermath was far more entertaining. As soon as the paperwork was complete, people started approaching me from every direction. Developers wanted meetings. Investors wanted conversations. Executives wanted partnerships. The same room that had ignored me for an hour suddenly acted as though I were the most important person in the building. My brother sat motionless. He looked like a man who had just discovered gravity was optional. Dad wasn't doing much better. Every few seconds he glanced between me and the documents, as if reality might correct itself if he stared hard enough. It didn't. Eventually he cleared his throat. So, you've been buying parking lots all these years? Mostly. How many? I told him. His eyes widened. My brother nearly fell out of his chair. You own that many properties? I lost count around 30. The silence that followed was beautiful. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. Beautiful. For the first time in my life, nobody had a joke ready. Nobody had a sarcastic comment. Nobody was comparing me to my brother. My girlfriend stood beside me, enjoying every second. Dad finally shook his head. I don't understand. She smiled politely. That's because you never asked? The entire room went quiet again. Dad looked genuinely embarrassed. It might have been the first time I'd ever seen it. On the way out of the building, he suddenly became the friendliest father on earth. The transformation was remarkable. A true miracle of nature. The man who had called me the family failure for years was now introducing me to strangers as a visionary entrepreneur. My girlfriend nearly walked into a wall laughing. At one point, Dad wrapped an arm around my shoulder. You know, son, I've always believed in you. I stared at him. My brother stared at him. Even Dad seemed slightly surprised by his own statement. Always? I asked. He coughed. Well, mostly. Interesting revision of history. My girlfriend laughed again. Later that evening we met for dinner to celebrate. For the first time, my family actually wanted to know how I had built everything. Not because they were planning to mock me. Because they genuinely wanted answers. I explained my strategy. Buy overlooked land. Be patient. Think long term. Ignore trends. Look for value where everyone else sees nothing. My brother listened carefully. Then he sighed. I spent years making fun of parking lots. You did. I owe you an apology. That surprised me more than the title office reveal. I accepted it. Life was too good to hold grudges. As dinner ended, my girlfriend finally revealed a little more about her own career. The moment Dad learned she was a senior interstellar development consultant responsible for projects worth billions of credits, he almost dropped his fork. Suddenly he became incredibly interested in her opinions. She smiled sweetly. That's strange. What is? You seem much nicer to successful people. I nearly choked on my drink. Dad turned bright red. My brother burst out laughing. Even Dad eventually laughed. For once, he deserved it. Later that night, my girlfriend and I stood together overlooking the city. Many of the lights shining in the distance sat on land I owned. Years of work. Years of patience. Years of being underestimated. She slipped her hand into mine. You know, she said, humans are fascinating. Why? Every other species in the Alliance brags about success. We do plenty of that. Not you. I smiled. No. Not me. She leaned against my shoulder. You let them think you were a failure for years. I knew the truth. She looked up at me. And now? I glanced toward the skyline and laughed. Now I'm probably the most expensive parking attendant in human history. She laughed with me. A few minutes later my phone buzzed. It was a message from Dad. 3 words. Can we talk? A second message arrived immediately afterward. And please stop reminding everyone about the failure thing. I smiled and sent a reply. Sure. But I'm keeping the parking lot where your truck got towed last year. His response arrived almost instantly. You're definitely my son. For the first time in a very long time, that felt less like criticism and more like a compliment.